The third balance patch of Alterac Valley has gone live for about 3 days now, and I think I'm pretty confident when I say, I think I figured out the best decks you can climb the legend with. I know the title of this video says that I have 5 decks prepared, but I've actually got 15 different decks ready for you guys in order to show you what exactly the metagame is looking like and the decks that I have been experiencing the most at top 500 legend. I will say that if you want the best results, obviously try to stick to the tier 1 and the tier 2 decks, but the reason why I'm showing you a tier 3 and a tier 4 of my own opinion of stuff that I've experienced is to kind of give you an idea of what the metagame is turning into now that the nerfs have gone live, and Thief Rogue is pretty much non-existent. Like, Rogue is gone almost completely off the map, so we're seeing a lot of Druids and a lot of Shamans, actually. A lot of Shamans compared to what I was seeing beforehand, and even to an extent, we're seeing a lot of Quest Handlock. So let me go ahead and walk you guys through what I believe are going to be the best decks for your Legend climb. So to start off the tier 1 decks, I want to walk you through Ramp Druid, because this is probably going to be a deck that I make yet another video about, because this is just the only deck that I've had an obscene win rate with. I've been able to maintain a 70% win rate with 2 different lists of Ramp Druid. I was using No Hands version with the variant Knight of Stormwind, but unfortunately that card just had some, that deck I should say, had a lot of synergies that just kind of didn't work every single time. While this deck I feel like is the best deck that I have played, and CaelesLuna was able to reach rank 4 legend with this particular list, and we'll be going for his rank 1 climb later today, so I'll be sure to pop his link in the description for you guys so you can check that out. But Ramp Druid just feels absolutely dominant right now because it feels like it could beat everything. The early turn Guffs are really important in order to get as much mana as possible, in order to just literally cheat out games. Like, you cheat mana, you cheat the game. It's just kind of how it works. But one card that I want to point out is the Wingmaster, the Wing Commander Mulverick. This card is insanely good, and I'll go ahead and show a clip of you, a clip of why this card is good, because if you go up against a Tunnel Trog on turn 1, you technically have an answer to it. If you have Lightning Bloom and Coin with this card in hand, you can easily play it on turn 1 and completely fill up your board with 2 1s and have the Mulverick survive. So that's the main reason why this card is in the deck, because of that insane high roll. But everything else is pretty straightforward. The only weird inclusions I would say would be the exclusion of Yashiraj and the inclusion of Mutanus. And the main reason for that is because at top 1000 legend or top 500 where I've been climbing right now, there are a lot of quest decks, and there's a decent amount of quest decks on this list once we progress through it. But that's the main reason why Mutanus is in there, in order to maybe put up a threat against those decks. Plus, Mozaki Mage and other combo decks are still somewhat on the ladder, so getting rid of those win cons can be good. And even in the Druid mirror, you can get rid of the big minions like the Malagos, like eating a Yogg. There are some people that still play Yashiraj. Like, Mutanus just feels like a pretty good way of Druid being able to interact with the opponent versus just waiting for them to throw down a minion and hopefully your Lieutenant can kill them. Because Abominable Lieutenant is cool with the Strongmen package, but without Yashiraj, I really couldn't justify it. So I think that this deck might be the best version of Ramp Druid, and in the future I plan on making a video specifically highlighting this deck once I get some more wins under my belt. I have about like 25-ish games, so it's still pretty good, and I would highly recommend playing Ramp Druid if you are into this style of archetype. The next deck that I have in tier 1 is going to be Questlock, though, and I'm not really showcasing the perfect 30 here. This is more so to give you an idea of how this archetype has kind of changed in the past couple of days, because people are trying to figure out if going for board is more consistent or if going for full combo is more consistent. And what I mean by that is people are now running Unstable Shadow Blast and Handed Gul'dans in their list, and taking out the Flesh Giant and the Anetheron package because they know that Warlock can just cycle through its deck very quickly. And sometimes being on the board doesn't really win you the game when you're going up against things like Control Warrior. Ramp Druid has ways of being able to find bunny rabbits in order to kill your board. So I think that some players are getting kind of annoyed by having their gigantic 8/8s wiped out and then just losing regardless when they could have just gone for combo. So I'm gonna put 2 different deck lists down below, one with the Giants and Battleground Battlemasters package, and one with the Handed Gul'dan as a win con, because I really can't tell which one is superior to the other, but just know that Questlock is still really good. In fact, I ended up making a video prior to this recording saying that Questlock was tier 3 a day ago, and then yesterday on ladder I went up against like almost 50% Warlock, so the deck is definitely running itself onto the top of the ladder one way or another. It's just about whether or not it's going to stay on top versus being second to something else. But Quest Warlock is still an insanely good deck. The lower ladder players are probably going to be annoyed to see this deck again, but if you're wanting to get some easy legend points, this is probably the way to go. And to finish up the tier 1 decks, we have Face Hunter. I don't think I need to tell you why Face Hunter is good, but I will let you know that this deck is kind of falling out of popularity for some reason, and I don't think it has to do anything with the power level of the deck. I feel like people just don't want to be playing Face Hunter right now, because it really depends on what you're going up against on the ladder. If you're fighting a lot of shamans, shamans are somewhat difficult for you to beat, not just because you can't really kill them, but because they can destroy your board and then present a more threatening board than you. So that matchup kind of keeps Hunter a little bit at bay, but the main reason why Face Hunter is so good is because it's beating all the people that are experimenting with the OTK decks that got nerfed, and it's also beating the main decks that people are literally trying to win every single game with. So I feel like Face Hunter is still going to be one of the best decks for newer players to play, and according to HS Replay, it is the best deck, or I'm sorry, the best class compared to everything else since the balance changes have come out. So if you're a newer player, Face Hunter is just the way to go for something that's not necessarily as expensive as all the other decks. 2 legendaries may be a little bit much for most players, but this deck is worth the craft if you're just trying to get quick wins. And now let's go ahead and dive into tier 2, because I believe a lot of these decks are going to be really solid Hearthstone decks, but it depends on how they do into the tier 1 decks. So case in point, Quest Shaman is something that is definitely not really good into the Quest Warlock variant, but it's pretty much good against every other deck that's available in the top legend ranks right now. So against Ramp Druid, against Bolner Shaman, it's got a pretty good win rate against Face Hunter and Beast Druid because of the Perpetual Flame clears. Libram Paladin is a very easy matchup. Big Spell Mage isn't really all that consistent and that popular, but if you fight that or Ping Mage, you can defeat this deck pretty easily. Quest Shaman is something I'm not really the most familiar with, but Pizza has been climbing in the top 500 rank for the past couple of days with this list, and I think that that the Quest Shaman has a lot of potential, very similar to how Burn Shaman is. So like if we look at Burn Shaman, I think that these two decks can be placed in like a very similar build, because you have the board and OTK version of the quest, or you have the just straight up burn and freeze mechanic of the other deck with this deck, and I think that both have a pretty good potential of being able to be very powerful at top 1000 legend. Burn Shaman is going to be a lot more volatile though. I feel like this deck is a lot more dependent on the matchups that you get, while Quest Shaman is going to be better all around the board, but you're probably going to be seeing more 50-50s than favorable or unfavorable matchups like you will be seeing with Burn Shaman. But I believe that both of these decks are good into tier 2 because they have good matchups going into the tier 1 decks, but this style of Shaman just seems really broken to me, and I'm surprised that there aren't more people that are experimenting with Burn Shaman, but Quest Shaman is definitely something a lot of people are playtesting and having success with right now. Continuing on with tier 2, we have Aggro Druid as well as Beast Druid. Right now, these decks are very, very similar. It's just about what mechanic that you really want to abuse. So obviously in this deck, the Oracle of Elune into Razormane Battle Guard is still an extremely effective combo. However, you're never playing the 5-mana taunts anymore because the meta has just evolved past the point where we can run those kind of mid-range cards. So this deck is just all in on just being able to generate a quick board very massively, and being able to buff it up with an Arbor up very standard, while the other deck is a little bit more nuanced in terms of what you can accomplish with it. I don't think this is the best 30 card list, but my co-caster Den has been playing this list specifically and is able to make top 50 in 2 different servers on NA and on EU, so I don't think I can take that very lightly. Den is a very well-versed player, and I respect when he's able to climb the top legends with these off-meta strategies. And if I'm being honest, the only thing I really don't like in here is the Captured Coldtooth Mine as well as the Pathmaker. I've played this deck personally, and I always had this card in my hand when it didn't get any value, so it was just literally a 3-mana 3/4. So if you want my honest opinion, you can probably cut some of these cards and make a build more along this line, where it's less on the Captured Coldtooth Mine, Pathmaker, and it's just more on the Beast and just making a big board. Not saying that these 3 cards are the main steak and potatoes that Beast Druid is known for, but these 3 cards just feel like they're unneeded side dishes in a deck that already feels pretty somewhat optimal. Maybe this is something that Den just likes better, so we can always draw his beasts versus sacrificing the squirrel, because if you want to run Living Seed, you can't run squirrel, so maybe that's a reason why. I can kind of understand that, but me personally, Beast Druid has been a deck that gets absolutely styled on by Ramp Druid, not only in the literal sense because of how many big minions you're playing, but when you have a big Mally that comes down against Beast Druid, it can literally be game winning. So I think that this is probably a better deck for people at the lower levels of ladder, because you're going to be steamrolling against more people that A, don't know how to play against the game, and B, probably aren't aware or ready to fight an aggro deck that's able to kill them as early as turn 5. But I think that Beast and Aggro Druid are probably the best aggro decks to play if you don't want to play Face Hunter or you can't afford Face Hunter. At least Beast Druid, it's a little bit less expensive. There are some epics you have to craft, but just know that Beast Druid is still a really good archetype. For some reason, I can't put it in tier 1 though, because the tier 1 decks just absolutely demolish it, and Beast Druid, in my experience, at least while playing it, hasn't been all too good, versus everybody else's experience, they seem to be doing well with it. So I just had to put it on here for that reason. Up next, I have Bolner OTK Shaman, and when I originally was making this video, I wanted to put Bolner OTK Shaman at the top of tier 1, but since playing yesterday, I almost didn't see this archetype at all in top 1000 Legend, and that's mainly due to the fact that this deck actually loses to most of the tier 1 decks that I have already listed for you. It doesn't have the best Ramp Druid matchup. Ramp Druid is a really easy way of being able to high roll Shaman because of the large amount of minions that you can cheat. Quest Handlock is an absolute nightmare because you can't kill them faster than they can pop off the combo, plus they can make bigger boards, and if you don't have the Snowfall Guardian ready at the right moment, you're just going to get steamrolled. And the Face Hunter matchup is probably your best matchup in the tier 1. It's not the greatest. It's like a 55, maybe 45 for the Hunter, like 45% for the Hunter. You're slightly favored as the Bolner Shaman, but this deck has a lot of really beefy draws, and if you get those draws against that matchup, you're not going to win that consistently. So this deck is really cool and is teched probably the most out of all of the decks that we're seeing in top 1000 Legend, to the point where we're still running Viper. I think that Viper is something that's kind of necessary in order to deal not only with the poison rogues that are still trying to thrive into the meta, but you can defeat Libram Paladin with it. You can stop hunters from being able to get another secret, which isn't the most important thing, but you can also stop the warriors from playing the Rokara. Maybe Viper isn't all that good now that I've said this out loud, but I like the idea of having the tradable because there's not a lot of card draw with this deck outside of like the Wind Chills and the notable the Diligent Note Taker combos that you have possible. But I still think that Bolner OTK Shaman is one of the most difficult decks to play, but when you play it well, you have an amazing matchup spreadsheet. But regardless, it's really bad into the tier 1 deck, so I have to put it into tier 2 because it does have some noticeable weaknesses. But if you want my honest opinion, I think this is probably one of the coolest Hearthstone decks that's available in the current patch right now. And that's only because Iron Deep Trial got nerfed and I was playing Guff Druid when I thought that was the most Hearthstone deck ever. But regardless, if you're wanting to play an intricate deck that has a lot of different ways to win a game, I would highly suggest Bolner OTK Shaman, just for the fact that it's so much fun to play. And for this next deck, the Meat Man has properly baited me because I've been playing a little bit of Miracle Priest on ladder, and I actually don't have that bad of a win rate. I have a little bit over a 50% if I remember correctly. Okay, no, I'm sorry. I'm 6-9 with this deck, so I had a little bit of a losing streak on my last stream with it. But Meati is currently sitting around top 5, almost rank 1 legend with his style of Miracle Priest, and John Bray's been playing this deck as well. Doing very similar ranks on the EU server, but this is probably one of the hardest decks to play on this list because it's not that straightforward when you don't get the easiest combo possible, and that's just high rolling the Nazmani discounts into the Mali. This deck is very important for you to learn how to win without your main win con, so you might have to flub around and find like a random dragon that's really good to copy with the Psychic Split. Maybe you have to Psychic Split your opponent's minions in order to give yourself a really big taunt and then do something further with that. Maybe the way that you win with this deck is to just have a really good Zarella clear with Desperate Prayer in order to stop an aggro deck. Like, there's a lot of different win cons that are available with this deck, and I will go ahead and link Meati's minute breakdown of this deck in order to give you guys a better idea of how to pilot it, because it's really hard for me to explain all the intricacies of this deck, but it's just better that you learn how to play this deck fundamentally and then learn how to have those other games where you have to win with your other win cons and not with the Mali, because you just need experience with this deck. That's pretty much what I'm trying to say. This deck is very important that you know what you're doing at every single stage of the game, even to the point where you can you know why you're skipping your turns 3 through 5. The whole point of this deck is to try and get as much value out of the palm reading as possible if you have a really greedy matchup, and it's important that you know that, so that way you don't just play palm reading and miss your corruptions on insight and miss like all the discounts that you can get that will hopefully win you the game. So again, Meati's breakdown of this deck is down below in the description. If you want to know more about Miracle Priest, I would highly suggest you check it out. This deck is probably more so tier 3, but in the right hands, I believe this could be a tier 2 deck because of the insane power level swings and the insane gigantic boards that you can threaten out of nowhere. And unless you're playing up against a deck that has a lot of active removal or gigantic AoEs, they're almost never going to be able to deal with a turn 5 Mali combo. And finally, running up the rear of tier 2 is Fel OTK Demon Hunter. And before I go into the strengths of this deck, no, I don't think that this list that I'm providing you is like this deck is better than this deck than this deck. It's just the order that I had these decks placed on my client. But I do believe that Fel Demon Hunter has really good matchups into Quest Handlock, into Bolner OTK Shaman, into Face Hunter. So that's 2 tier 1 decks, so you have really good win rates against. Ramp Druid is probably the biggest reason why Fel Demon Hunter is not seeing all too much play, because it has an abysmal win rate of almost 25% against the Ramp Druid, because there's almost no way that you can deal with the armor. There's almost no way that you can deal with a large board that comes down unless you're setting up the combo, and you're just really reliant on either getting a Magtheridon clear or a Kurtrus Demon Render out on the field, to where it makes it really awkward for the Druid to commit anything onto the board. But this matchup is a little bit skill testing. I've lost this a decent amount of times just because I don't know how I'm playing into the matchup sometimes. Whenever I'm streaming, I'm focusing more on chat, and sometimes I'll make some suboptimal plays. But whenever you make a suboptimal play against Fel Demon Hunter and you give them enough board in order to interact with, obviously the Expendable Performers combo with the Felfire Dreadeye is going to be extremely consistent. But the reason why this deck is so good is because it has 2 really good matchups into tier 1 decks and 1 really unfavorable matchup. So if you're willing to flip those coins and to take that chance, I think that Fel Demon Hunter could be a fun deck for you to play. It is very straightforward in terms of how it does play, because you're not really actively threatening a board that kills your opponent. You have to set up either the combo with Jace or with the Expendable Performers. But regardless, Fel Demon Hunter has pretty good matchups all around the board, except for the Ramp Druid matchup. So if you're not seeing that many Ramp Druids, spam some Fel Demon Hunter, play some Jaces, and have a good time. And now for the rest of this video, I want to show you guys some decks that might be worth it, but are going to have a pretty difficult time depending on where you are on the ladder. And it's kind of ironic that I'm going to be showing you guys 2 nerf decks to start off this segment, because guess what? Poison Rogue and Mozaki Mage are still playable decks. I know. Go ahead and boo me. Go ahead and tell me that I'm wrong. Go ahead and say that these decks are absolutely the worst experience in Hearthstone. But regardless, they are still a playable deck, because I have gone up against them at top 500 Legend, and I have actually lost to a Poison Rogue. One of the only games that I lost to against Rogue was against a Poison Rogue, because they just kind of had the nuts. This deck still works really good if you have Double Cloak into Scabs into the insane pop-off turn. The weapon is still the nuts if you get all the poisons on it. And if you think about it, a lot of people are not running Viper anymore, so this kind of gives you a reason just to slam your weapon and then just be greedy with it. Although Poison Rogue is one of those decks that is always going to be one of my least favorite archetypes of all time, second to like Garrote Rogue. It's really the style of Rogue that just kills you after being on the board every single freaking turn. I just really don't like the fact that Rogue feels like it has so much room in every single phase of the game, to where it can kind of do whatever it wants and just kind of ignore the opponent. But Mage is doing something very similar, to where it really isn't changing itself all too much, except for the fact that it's now running it now runs Ice Barrier to kind of give itself a little bit more time. And I didn't point this out with the Poison Rogue, but we don't run Null and Maestro anymore because it's really not worth it. The mana discounts really aren't good enough in order to get that kind of value, so you're just going for that kind of typical value of just going for the combo. And same thing with the Mozaki OTK Mage. This deck really hasn't changed all too much, except for the Ice Barrier inclusion. You still want to go for your flows. You still want to cheat out as much mana as possible, get your multicaster draws, and then you get your Mozaki played. So it's just, these decks apparently aren't going anywhere, and it's sad for me to report that these decks are not 100% dead. But just know that at the lower ladder, it's probably going to make a difference, because there's going to be more aggro, there's going to be more decks that are fighting for the board. So maybe you can beat these decks at the lower ladder, and if you're trying to climb these decks at the lower ladder to the high legend, you're probably going to have a little bit of problems. But just know that these archetypes are still doable. If you're wanting to get rid of your Mozaki or to get rid of your Poison Rogue for dust purposes and you're on the edge, let me go ahead and tell you that you probably don't need to do it. Play it a few more games and see if you can get a few wins under your belt, and then realize that these decks are not dead. That's really all I wanted to say with this little segment here, is that Mozaki Mage and Poison Rogue aren't dead. And unfortunately, the nerfs didn't do exactly what everybody would like, but I kind of like it when nerfs don't straight up kill decks. But unfortunately, the next deck I'm about to tell you is pretty dead, and I'm kind of sad that it died versus these other 2 decks surviving. And now going into the tier 4 decks, And now going into the tier 4 decks that can still somewhat win, but are just not nearly as powerful as they need to be or as people believe that they are. So unfortunately, this version of Thief Rogue is, I think, dead. I have only seen this deck on the ladder a handful of times, and that was in like the first 24 hours of the patch, and I ended up going like 9-1 with this particular deck, but then suddenly when I started playing it more on the second and third day, it literally never got a win. Unfortunately for Thief Rogue, I feel like the meta is starting to evolve to the point where face hunters are knocking it out. Quest Warlocks are able to beat this deck consistently now, and the rest of tier 2 is just able to deal with the fact that the gnolls don't just automatically win the game. Like, it's really kind of annoying how Thief Rogue was literally this good because of Wild Paw Gnoll, and like the rest of the deck didn't even get touched. It was the only thing that was nerfed outside of Scabs, and the Scabs nerf really didn't make all too much of an impact, if you want my honest opinion. It's the fact that the meta just completely warped itself to where now that the decks that were really weak into Poison Rogue that were good into Thief Rogue are now more in the spotlight. I think that this deck still has potential. I wanted to play this deck a lot in the first week, but then every single time I played it after the first day, it just kept losing. So unfortunately, we might have to hit the drawing board on how to remake this deck, but the 6-mana Gnoll and the 8-mana Scabs did enough to this deck in order to knock it out completely out of tier 1, completely out of tier 2, damn near out of tier 3, and it's barely surviving at tier 4 according to HS Replay. And I just don't see anybody else really trying to bring back this archetype. I haven't really seen Jay Alexander mess with it yet, but I haven't really been actively looking on his stream, so I can't say that for sure. But regardless, I think that Thief Rogue is officially dead, and I do find it really annoying that this deck died for Poison Rogue and Mozaki Mage to barely survive, and it's just like, I loved this deck. I thought it was cool, but unfortunately it's dead now and we can't play it. So don't get baited by Thief Rogue unless you see Jay Alexander have some kind of insane post with it. The next deck on this list is going to be something from Monsanto, and I do believe this deck has a ton of potential, but it's very dependent on the metagame that you're going up against, because Monsanto was doing really well with this deck into Druid. So this deck has a really good ramp Druid matchup, but everything else I feel like kind of suffers because, unfortunately, a lot of OTKs are kind of in the front runner of the meta right now, such as the Quest Warlock and the Bolner OTK Shamans being somewhat popular. But there are ways of this deck being able to kind of fight back with, like, its KT turns with, like, Provoke. You have ways of being able to get a gigantic weapon, and this almost feels like Weapon Warrior to a degree, where you always have either this weapon, you have the Kresh weapon, or the Rokara weapon equipped. And something that's really important to note about this particular deck is that it's taking advantage of the Rokara into Shield Shatter combo. So on turn 7, you can just do this, play a 5 damage AoE, and then maybe be able to commit like some damage to the face, maybe trade off like an 8/8, so that way it deals 8 damage to the opponent. So there are ways that this deck can have some pretty cool turns, and I've actually been able to pop off a lethal with to the front Faceless Manipulator and Captain Galvangar. So this is pretty much like Control Warrior with an actual win con. This deck feels very cool, very awesome to play from Monsanto, but again, the issue with Control Warrior right now is the fact that the meta is not geared at all for this deck to do successfully, so I feel like it's very dependent on your pocket metas. If you're seeing nothing but Druids and aggro decks, then go for it. Then you can maybe win a few games with this deck, because fighting for tempo really isn't as hard as you would imagine. The only thing that really sucks about this deck is that you pretty much have the full mulligan for your good 2-drops and maybe the weapon, so that way you can just immediately trade into the deck, get another durability off of it like it's nothing, and then you have like your Arbor Scamps and your Corsair Cash in order to give you some more consistent draw. You have Cutting Class ready to go when you have the weapon. So there are some good synergies here to note out, but unfortunately for the metagame, it's just not good enough for Control Warrior, and unless you're Monsanto, I don't know if a lot of people can have an obscenely high win rate with this deck. I ended up only going like 4-5 with it, but the fact that I was able to win 4 games in top 500 Legend at all was a little bit astounding. So if you want to play Control Warrior and you don't just want to play a deck that does nothing but just play AoE and wait and wait and wait, it can actually kill your opponent, this is a way to do it. You have Rattlegore, you have Captain Galvangar, and you even have Big Mutanus Eats in order to hopefully stop the Questline deck. So this deck does have a lot going for it. Just know that the metagame is not going to treat you nicely. And the last deck that we have on this list is Big Spell Ping Mage. Unfortunately, I don't think that either Big Spell Mage or Ping Mage is that good, and this was the only version of the deck that I fought on ladder that did any that had any real chance against me. I feel like this deck kinda is trying to beat up on Druids because of how greedy it is. You have a lot of big spells like the Mass Polymorph and the Mass Cthulhu in order to give you some kind of like actual way of winning the game. You have the Maestro in order to double up that kind of value. And then you have the Rune of the Archmage in order to hopefully scam something if they have that gigantic board that you can't clear. And the rest of this deck is just, you know, kind of like aggro hate if you really look at it. You have the Varden in order to give you another turn. You have plenty of stall with your ice barriers. You have the Fire Sail off of the Deep Water Evoker that is sometimes possible. So there's like this deck, it has synergies, but unfortunately I can never see it win. So for those of you guys that are like really big Spell Mage or Ping Mage fans, go ahead and leave a comment down below, because unfortunately I just don't see how this deck wins unless your opponent does absolutely nothing throughout the entire stage of the game, or you get so lucky to where you have your Wildfires set up, you have your Reckless Apprentice ready to go, you curve it into the Talon Forgery, and then you have your Mordresh just ready to go on turn 8. I don't see how this deck wins outside of having the perfect setup, so maybe this deck has something going for it, and this is not something I'm seeing off of HS Replay. This was an actual opponent that I went up against. When I looked at HS Replay, the Ping Mage and the Big Spell Mage were completely divided. There was no mix between them, but both decks really didn't seem that good to me, and I thought this one was at least a little bit spicy, but it's still probably not that good of an archetype. I'm sorry, guys. And when you look at the data on HS Replay, it's just like it's got a bad matchup into Ramp Druid, a bad matchup into Quest Handlock. It's 50-50, but it's not that bad. But the fact that you're going to be seeing it that frequently is going to be somewhat difficult for you. The only positive matchup that I'm seeing according to HS Replay is against Quest Priest. That should tell you how bad the deck is. So I would not recommend playing this deck unless for some reason you really like Big Spell Mage or you really like playing Ping Mage and you can figure out how to tell this YouTuber how the hell this deck even wins, because outside of these stats that I'm looking at, and I'll go ahead and put them on the screen in order to show you guys exactly what I'm seeing, I don't see that Ping Mage is going to make that kind of comeback or it's going to make any kind of impact on the metagame. So I just don't see this deck being good, and I've kind of ranted enough about it. So again, if you know how this deck performs, feel free to let me know down in the comments, because I just don't see how this deck ever wins a game of Hearthstone. But there you guys have it. There are 15 decks you guys can try to take onto the Legend ladder and hopefully get some good results. If you guys ever have any questions about how these decks play, or maybe specific like tech inclusions, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoy this kind of content, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel in order to be notified about any other future uploads we happen to come out with. All of the deck codes are going to be down below, so you guys can copy all of those lists and hopefully get a win or two on the Legend ladder with them. And if you've never hit Legend before, I got a video coming out pretty soon that's going to give you a bunch of tips on how to do your climb. We also got a Patreon that's available for anyone that wants special bonuses and perks for supporting the content. And as always, if you want to see these clips live, we stream at twitch.tv/CaelesLuna. I hope you guys enjoy ruling Alterac Valley and what will hopefully be the last balance patch before we get the mini set. And we'll see you guys for the next video.